As we work through this idea of moral formation, I think it's important that we start with the concept of conscience. What is our conscience? Can it be formed? How does the conscience contribute to moral discernment? Conscience is a word that gets tossed around a lot right now, on both in both progressive and conservative circles in very different ways. So I'm going to spend part of this lecture just talking about different ways that people have used conscience, different things people have meant by conscience. I'm going to bring up a few of the key points from Veritatis Splendor, and then in class we can talk a little bit more about Veritatis Splendor and about the Newman essay, which is a pretty definitive statement for conscience in Christian theology, but I think is also worth, it has been read in a number of ways, so I think it's worth our careful consideration. So what does conscience mean? Conscience obviously comes from the Latin combination of the two Latin words conscientia, which means a joint knowledge or a knowing with. But what does conscience help us to know, and who or what are we knowing with? The idea of conscience and the use of this term doesn't show up in Aristotle, doesn't show up in Plato. It's rather a Stoic conception. It's was expressed in different ways and by different Stoic philosophers, but as a basic idea, it is the awareness that we have of doing wrong within ourselves. It's part of the Stoic idea about the importance of self-control and self-regulation. While concepts that we can look back and see as conscience show up throughout Scripture, really conscience was brought into Christian theology by St. Paul. There's a lot of literature out there about how St. Paul is influenced by Stoic ideas. If you're interested, I would look it up, but if you're curious, you can just go and look, do a Google search on Bible Gateway and see how many times conscience all of a sudden pops up in all of the Pauline corpus. Obviously, he was using the Greek term, but the Latin conscience is the Latin translation. So in Acts and in a number of the other letters, Paul talks about his clear conscience, that he does not feel guilty or concerned about the way he is engaging with other Christians, about his actions, specifically about his engagement with the Jewish law code. He talks a lot about his conscience being clear. He also, in Romans 2:15, which really could be the key verse for our course, talks about conscience as there's something called conscience that bears witness to the law written on the Gentiles' heart. So he's establishing a link between this concept of conscience, this conscience and the awareness within us, and the natural law. And then in 1 Corinthians and in some in 1 Timothy and 2 Corinthians, he has this idea that people have different levels of development of conscience, particularly when he's talking about food sacrificed to idols. He talks about the concept of protecting those with a weaker conscience. So there's a sense that conscience is within everyone. There's a sense of conscience as providing our judgment or referendum on our actions, and there's a sense of this connection between conscience and the natural law. So it's through St. Paul that conscience comes into through St. Paul and through the Stoics, that we have this concept of conscience in Western theology and philosophy. So let's take a little survey of how different key figures have talked about conscience, so we can think about all these different ideas of conscience that are floating around today. So first, Aquinas. As we know, Romans 2:15 is a really big deal for Aquinas. He focuses on conscience being something that applies the natural law, these abstract precepts that we know through the natural law to our own specific situations. Conscience is the tool of judgment and discernment. There's obviously a sense that conscience has to be formed for Aquinas, because you can have an erroneous conscience. You can misapply the natural law. You can learn how to do it better. But that's the key point for Aquinas. Kant, as we talked about with Kant, what we get with Kant is we get a removal or distancing of God from questions of moral reasoning. So when Kant talks about conscience and metaphysics of moral, he talks about conscience as practical reason holding the human being's duty before him for his acquittal and condemnation in every case that comes after a law. So some similarities to Aquinas here, this link to practical reason, the application to specific circumstances, this idea of duty. But as you see here, there's no God in this concept. There's no sense that conscience is informed by God. Conscience is simply the application of the moral law that we have discerned according to our duty within ourself. So for Kant, conscience is our ability to turn inward, to engage in abstract reasoning, to determine the right. All right, let's go to the other extreme. Rousseau, one of the preeminent philosophers and theorists of Romanticism. And he describes in his book, I think it's from, I can never pronounce it, Amelie, that this idea that there is therefore at the bottom of our hearts an innate principle of justice and virtue by which, in spite of our maxims, we judge our own actions and those of others to be good and evil, and it is this principle that I call conscience. So what Rousseau thinks is that we are all born with this really innate sense of the good, innate sense of virtue, and we lose that through education, through the impositions of laws and reason and nature. And what is supposed to happen is that people are supposed to be free to go back to their natural state where they'll discern the good without all the trappings of civilization. So whereas Kant, conscience is the articulation of duty, Rousseau, we're able to get in touch with conscience through freedom from duty, through becoming in touch with our natural desires, our natural innate principles. We then go to the Freudian principle of conscience. So for Freud, conscience is the superego, which judges the ego, and it produces guilt and shame within us. It doesn't seem like, I'm not no Freudian scholar, but that Freud has the sense that the sense that we see in Aquinas, Kant, and Rousseau, that conscience puts us in touch with some type of true moral fact. Rather, conscience is all about the emotions, these feelings of shame and guilt, and something we may need to seek freedom from, rather than something that can enable us to discern the right or the good. So in the last century, we've seen a few further new ideas of what conscience is come into discussion. Like many other ideas in moral theology and moral philosophy, World War II was incredibly formative in how we talk about these concepts. So we have the idea of conscience as resistance to corrupt authority. One of the things that really horrified people after World War II and the Nuremberg trials and investigations of what happened in Nazi Germany is that all of these sort of mid-level Nazi officials or people who are collaborators with the Nazis said, well, look, I'm not morally responsible. I just did what I was supposed to do. I just followed the rules. And so it's the people who are changing the rules who are at fault. So this led to a revitalization of the interest of conscience, and an idea that there is something that, again, a moral fact that conscience can be in touch with, and that conscience becomes the capacity to resist corrupt authority, to resist injustice, to stand up against the claims. Another sense of conscience that grew more out of the 60s and 70s is the idea of conscience as self-identity. And here's a quote from the mid-70s from a man named James Childress. In appealing to conscience, I indicate I'm trying to preserve a sense of myself, my wholeness and integrity, my good conscience, and that I cannot preserve these qualities if I submit to certain requirements of the state or society. So this is different from the conscience's resistance idea in that the moral facts that conscience is in touch with are not some sort of sense of the objective good, but rather objective truth about who I am, my self identity. You can see that there are some ties here between this and Rousseau, this sense of finding the authentic self freed from the constraints of society. And being true to my conscience means that I'm true to that identity. We have another sense as well that comes up particularly in rights discourse, and that shows up a lot in political, well, actually conscience of self-identity shows up a lot, and this idea of freedom of conscience. The UN Declaration of Human Rights says everyone has a right to freedoms of thought, conscience, and religion. And what this means is, how this is often read, is that there are certain moral decisions that ruling authorities can't take from me, that I have the right to not be constrained in certain key areas of life, often related to religion and thought, and that we need to make sure that people don't limit our actions according to the freedom of our conscience to make moral decisions. This historically came up a lot in conscientious objector cases. It's now coming up a lot in so-called religious liberty cases. So this is you can see how broad the ideas of conscience are. And sometimes and often we have a sense that conscience is a way we are in touch with some objective good, but it may not be. We also have a sense of conscience often as resistance to authority. In Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II is engaging specifically with these 2 points. How does conscience relate to authority, and how does conscience relate to the objective good? Is there an objective good? What is this objective good? So he sets up the dynamic between conscience as the voice of God within us, conscience as a witness to what God has said and to God's moral law, and conscience as not phrase he uses, but conscience as a get out of jail free card. Conscience as a claim about my own subjective sense of the good that can trump other claims, other authorities. And he describes this as a distance between judgment, which is making a decision about something outside ourselves, which is ascertaining the truth about something outside ourselves, and decision, which is based purely on our own personal private judgment. So conscience is the voice with God within us versus conscience as a get out of jail free card. On the topic of authority, he asked, is conscience opposed to doctrine? Is conscience the way we resist the claims of authority? Or is conscience formed by doctrine? And we'll talk about this question in relationship to Newman too. He also makes the key theological point that, his read is that conscience does have a connection to the objective moral order, but it is not infallible. It doesn't always discern it correctly. Our passions, our desires can get in the way of this proper discernment. However, this is a key point in Roman Catholic moral theology, even an erroneous conscience must be obeyed. And if it is obeyed, you're actually not morally culpable because you don't have a choice except to act otherwise. However, even though you may not be morally culpable, what you are doing is still evil. Conscience isn't a get out of free card in the sense that it erases the evil that may result from someone acting according to an ignorant conscience. And then he considers this idea of formation of conscience, that conscience isn't opposed to authority, but is actually formed by the proper authorities. And that part of what the Christian tradition offers is resources for the proper formation of conscience, the ability to help people's conscience, through their conscience, discern the moral good properly. And this is also what Newman is engaging with as well in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. One quick note on that reading. This is Roman Catholic Newman, not Anglican Newman, and he's writing after Vatican I. And he's right. The letter is to the senior Catholic peer in England. Ostensibly, it's really it's really a pamphlet to be released, but he's trying to explain how the doctrine of conscience in the Roman Catholic tradition preserves moral autonomy, how this overcomes the concerns about the Vatican I articulation on the magisterial authority of the Pope. And so he's also trying to engage with a lot of the modern, what there for that time, modern concepts of conscience as much more autonomy and self-discerning.